space. And then we'll have time at the end, 15, 30 minutes for questions. We can hang out as well. So welcome again to Rutgers. So people have been excited about the election over the last several months. There have been a lot of reports and discussions about not just this topic, but going forward. People are picking out curtains, so to speak, in terms of future assignments. And I thought what I'd do today is kind of step back. A lot of the discussion, and rightly so, has been on the nuts and bolts. What should we do with solar policy? How about offshore wind? How should we tweak the energy efficiency programs and so forth? And what I thought I'd do is take a step back and look at the apparatus that these nuts and bolts are attached to. What's the policy-making apparatus? How are decisions are made? How can we think about this perhaps in a new light? So let me start off with my major points, then I'll give a little bit of context, and then some more specific findings, and I'll close with some additional recommendations. So first and foremost, achieving a clean energy future, and here I'll define that as something along the lines of the Global Warming Response Act, 80% reduction of greenhouse gases from today's levels, or roughly today's level, requires political support over the next 30 years. So people are very excited about the next governor, but we need to maintain that political support. It's a long journey, and any deviation over the next 30 years or so can set us back. So how do we go about thinking about that? Well, in addition to mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, there's going to be a need for adaptation. So the amount of climate change, severe weather, sea level rise, all those things depends in large part not on what New Jersey does, but about what the rest of the world does. So we have this competing set of investment with limited funds in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And my concern here is that unless we acknowledge that even if New Jersey got to zero greenhouse gases tomorrow, we would still need to spend a lot of money on adaptation. And if we go down the road where we pursue an aggressive mitigation path, which I'm not saying we shouldn't do, but we don't account for the fact or prepare the general public that that may not, that won't, for all practical purposes, reduce the effects of climate change, we may have some flashback or pushback, which will undercut the political support that's needed. Thirdly, the policies have to be cost effective. I think too much of the current approaches are well intended, and they're building programs and capabilities, policies and programs, but they're not really trying to scrutinize or reduce the cost to give a given level of output. And without that cost effectiveness, that will, I think, erode public support and again, perhaps push us back. So in order to do all this, what we need to do is put in place a cohesive strategy, which I'll talk about, and the right institutional framework. So it's not just about getting SREX right or getting energy efficiency right or offshore wind or combined heat and power, but put them in a common framework that's internally consistent that will actually achieve the results in a cost-effective way. And this requires, I think, really digging deep into the institutional capabilities and incentives and so forth in order to achieve this. So this is, I think, the fundamental problem. It's not a problem about should we spend more money here or there. Those are second order problems. The fundamental problem is getting the policy-making process right and oriented in a way that will be sustainable both politically and environmentally in the future. So with that, I'd like to just spend maybe 20 minutes on the size and the scope of the problem. So New Jersey's gross state budget or gross state product, GSP, is about $600 billion a year. It's doubled over the last 20 years or so. About 9 million people in New Jersey, poverty rate about 10%. The size of the problem is immense. We want to change the energy behavior of everyone in New Jersey, right, over the next 30 years, shift from one sector to one fuel base or fossil fuel base to another. And this involves millions of decisions of individuals, of organizations, of employers, and infrastructure. And how do we do that, right? How do we redirect over the next 30 years the energy piece of the state's economy in a way that is productive and cost effective? In terms of New Jersey, the purpose of this slide is I just want to emphasize the lower 20%. Energy costs are regressive, so if you're poor, you pay a higher percentage of your income for energy than richer people, not in absolute dollars, but in percentage. And so we just need to address this issue as well, because I think any meaningful change will require an increase in electricity prices and energy prices, oil prices, and so forth. So how do we go about addressing that? Just to give you an idea of the New Jersey energy economy, so to speak, it's roughly about $30 billion, about the size of the state budget, just to give you an order of magnitude, 5% overall. This is a little bit dated. It's from a 2009 EIA study. They're updating it now. But roughly a household will spend in New Jersey about $3,000. This may be a little high because it was in 2009 when gas prices were high. But in any event, about $3,000 for stationary energy, heating, electricity, natural gas, and so forth, not including transportation. And electricity is about half that, $1,500, okay, just to give you a sense of the numbers. In terms of prices, the retail rate, so that's the delivered electricity, is roughly 15 cents. It depends on which sector you're in, but roughly you're paying 15 cents a kilowatt hour or $150 a megawatt hour, just to give you a point of comparison. And natural gas is over here, basically $5 at the wholesale level, $12 at the retail level. Now, these retail rates include the societal benefits charge. It's about 4%, 3.8%. This is from the BPU's website. It's a little bit dated. It was 2010, but roughly the numbers are correct. So someone is putting into this pot of money about $50, $60 a year, both on the gas side and on the electric side. And then in addition, there's a sales and use tax in New Jersey, 6.X%, almost 7%. Okay, so I've been talking about cost effectiveness. Let's just define it a little bit more clearly. So here, the benefits exceed the costs, right? So you think I should do that. That makes sense. But if I can create, or if someone can propose a way to achieve the same benefits, but at lower cost, that's the policy it seems that we want to pursue, right? Because we can use that additional savings for something else, right? Either to pursue more clean energy efficiency or other social programs or whatever we want to do. And I think this is the area where we, a lot of work on current policy can yield some real positive results. So the way it's currently done, so let me just explain the graphs. So on the x-axis is total improvement. Think of it as reduction in tons of CO2, number of jobs created, whatever it is. And then the y-axis is the cost of doing so. So in effect, these are, I don't want to abuse the terminology, but supply curves in effect for different policies. And in New Jersey, we have a long range of different policies. We have class 1, 2, and 3 RECs. We have ORECs and SRECs. So I'm just going to collectively refer to them as XRECs, which is hard to say. Sounds like a bad movie, but in any event. And each of these programs, I was chatting with Mike Winker before, are separate in a sense, that we don't compare them across each other, at least not explicitly. So in order to achieve cost effectiveness for whatever metric we're trying to achieve, we need to, I think, compare these different policies given the amount of the goal that we want to achieve and line them up so that they're competing either through a planning process or through a competitive market process so that we, in effect, walk up this supply curve to achieve the result that we want at the least cost, at the most cost-effective amount. So we now have to tie this all into economic activity to, again, slightly oversimplified. People talk about direct jobs. So you invest in combined heat and power, offshore wind, or whatever. They're the direct jobs, the manufacturing jobs, the operation, maintenance, and so forth. Then on top of that, there are the indirect jobs, the suppliers that are supporting that construction effort, for example, and then the induced job. So you hear a lot of job numbers, and I bet we're going to hear a lot more about job numbers in terms of the employment impacts. And typically what people talk about, you have to be careful, are gross jobs. They're talking about these three pieces, or at least some of these three pieces. But in order to finance this, we need to take money from ratepayers, future ratepayers, and that displaces jobs because the money that I would have spent on coffee or entertainment is now being redirected. Doesn't mean it's a good idea or a bad idea, that's what's happening. And so the real calculation is to try to figure out these net jobs, right? What is the displaced jobs versus, and how do they compare with the gross jobs? And here I drew it where the green is greater than the red, but that doesn't have to be the case. Now, the way this is occurring, as I just mentioned, is over time. So in effect, we're borrowing or taxing future ratepayers over time to bring economic activity forward. Now, that can be a good idea, it can be a bad idea, but that's what we're doing, okay? So in terms of these jobs, both the jobs that are being created and the displaced jobs, this is what's happening. Okay, so we're borrowing from the future, and typically with energy, clean energy projects, they're capital intensive, and so as a result, most of the economic activity occurs in the early years, the construction, the manufacturing, and then over time, the operation maintenance typically are a small piece of the overall job. Now there's exceptions to that, but this is generally the approach. And so the question becomes, should we borrow from the future, right? There's nothing wrong with making good investments to bring that economic activity forward and reduce the environmental costs or whatever the other goals are. And that's basically the decision we're facing. So now with New Jersey, because just of where it is located and the types of resources it has and doesn't have, then the debate becomes, or the discussion becomes, how much of the revenue stays in state? So the case of interest is where we have a in-state resource. Maybe it's more expensive for whatever reason. Now, some of that money is spent in state, right? If the manufacturing or the equipment is produced elsewhere, a CHP plant, if the turbine is produced in Missouri and it's shipped to New Jersey, or a light bulb is produced somewhere else, Taiwan, and it's shipped here. But then some of that money is spent in state, some of it is not. Then we want to compare it to the cost of an out-of-state. Now, the interesting case is when the out-of-state resource is at a lower cost. And the question then is, are those additional costs that we're going to spend for the in-state resources, is that worth it? Could we have bought something that's predominantly the money will be out of state, and how cost-effective is that in terms of the overall economic activity compared to an in-state resource? Now, of course, some of the out-of-state resource expenditures may occur in New Jersey, right? There could be a wind farm in Pennsylvania who uses energy resources, engineering resources in New Jersey, or financing or insurance or whatever. So we have to do the analysis, a complete analysis. Now, if the reverse is the case, if the in-state resource is less expensive than the out-of-state resource, that's great. Then, the analysis is a little easier. But this is the case of interest. So that's the question here, which is this worth it, right? So that's the calculus we need to do. So now let's talk about the term that's most often confused is the word cost. If you want to have a discussion passed in the night, talk about cost. So here we have market costs. Those are the cost of building a facility. So brown here, a typical fossil fuel type approach. But in addition, there are the non-market costs, the externalities, the negative externalities. Typically with energy, they're negative. So the total cost is the sum of these two. The market cost is what gets reflected in our bills or the price at the pump. The case of interest is comparing to a cleaner technology that has higher market costs and lower non-market costs. We'll get to a moment if this has lower market costs than this. I wouldn't say we're all done, but we're pretty close to being done. And so this is the calculus, the comparison. So whenever someone uses the word cost, try to nail down, are they talking about this or that? And it's not just about greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are important. I'm not trying to undercut the priority there, but there are other pollutants, in particular particulate 2.5, that are very important. So this study was from data used in 2005, so it's a little bit dated. It's a modeling exercise of what's the the mortality consequences of air pollutants, in particular particulate 2.5. So here are the different sectors in the economy: electricity, commercial, road, marine, and rail. And here's New Jersey. It's done alphabetically. And the first column under each major column is the number of deaths per year. So that totals 8,312. Now, perhaps that has changed over time. There's certainly a large error bar. This is a modeling exercise. When someone dies from air pollution, unlike a car impact, we don't know the actual cause. They had a stroke or a heart attack, or they were elderly or whatever. Whereas a car accident, we know pretty much, with almost certainty, what's the cause of death. Just to make a comparison, I'll make a comparison in a moment. My point here is addressing the air quality issues overlaps a lot, but not completely with the greenhouse gas issues. So if your goal is to reduce greenhouse gases, a cost-effective approach may be different or may not be exactly coterminous with one if you're trying to improve air quality. Of course, they're not mutually exclusive. So this is the deaths in New Jersey in 2015 for different causes. The 8,000 would be a clear number 3, even if it was overstated by 50%. 4,000 would still be in the top 3. Just for fun, how many people died due to auto accidents in New Jersey this year or last year? Too many, sure, of course. How many is too many, though? Yep.
Close to the 18,430, I guess.
Okay, any other guesses? 607. Opioids. You see where I'm going with this? How many people? 2,000, 1,900. Of course, I'm not saying these aren't important problems. Of course, they're important problems, just as Gene indicated. But, you know, there's other issues as well. And so I think let's keep this because I think this priority needs to be emphasized. Okay, so now we're back to this energy efficiency. This is here where presumably the market cost is less than the market cost of the dirty, and this is, as people would say, a no-brainer, right? You're leaving money on the table. Now, what I'm going to do in the next several slides is not intended to be provocative, but it will be, I suspect. I just want to present some evidence to question this assumption that I think is all too prevalent that energy efficiency is a clear winner, okay? I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be pursued at the state or federal level. I'm just saying that because it's so important, we really need to tighten down our evaluation of this. And typically what happens is the below market costs, or at least what's on paper of energy efficiency, are used. This provides some headroom to then help fund a plan more renewables. This is what we did in the 2007-2008 Energy Master Plan. This is a recent analysis, did the same thing. There's nothing wrong with it. So if we can save money over here, we can offset some of the increase in prices due to moving towards renewables. That's a standard move, perfectly fine. I've made that move. Okay, so I'm going to present one side, intentionally one side of the literature, because I'm trying not to persuade you, or many of you, that this is the case, but at least it should be taken seriously. That's my point. So the economists have gone off, and basically there are several conclusions, but one is that many of the energy efficiency evaluations are not done using rigorous methods. They're using methods that are known to have biases in the upward direction. They overstate the analysis. And moreover, these types of analysis, this is material, 2 times, 2.5 times. Now, you can dispute those studies, and many people have. That's perfectly fine. I'm not saying this is the last word on this. I'm just saying that we should take this seriously if we're going to depend on the use of energy efficiency as a major or important piece of moving forward. So here's some of the evidence or the citations. Moreover, people tend to, at least there's some studies that report that people overstate the effectiveness of energy efficiency. So up here is utilities from the late 1980s and 90s, and here's a paper that a colleague and I did, or 2 papers. Here's the evidence. I just want to spend 1 minute on this just to graphically try to drive this point home. So that was on combined heat and power. So combined heat and power is where you combine a generation, you use the waste steam for some type of other use, heating, hotel loads, whatever. And the idea it's much more efficient than a regular power plant which just dumps the steam back into the ocean or the river. What this graph is on the x-axis, the capacity factor. The higher the capacity factor, the more efficient. The capacity factor is the percent of time that the combined heat and power unit runs at full output. Think of it as the occupancy rate of a hotel, right? The higher the occupancy rate, the more efficient that it is. On the y-axis is the standard deviation, just a measure of spread. And so what you would think, and when you read studies proposing or analyzing CHP and programs, is you get very high capacity factors in the 80 to 90, even above 90%, and very little variation. In other words, the assumption is these power plants work very well. They're running almost all the time. Of course, there are maintenance and outages and so forth. But the variance over here would be low, right? So it looks something like that. That's where you would expect to see the data. So what Rasika and I did, and then along with another student, both nationally but also in New York, which has very good data, we plotted over a 12-year period or so the annual capacity factor of every combined heat and power in the United States that we had available in the data set. Okay, so you'll see lots of dots. Each of those dots is a particular combined heat and power plant for a given year. So 10 of the dots would be for a particular plant for 10 years. 5 of the dots would be for a particular plot of plant for 5 years. So this is what the data looks like. We showed this to a stakeholder group, and then they asked every question but the logical one, which is maybe not all these units are efficient in the economic sense. They may be in an engineering sense. And they had a long list: age of the unit, the technology, the application, the region of the country, the date of it started. You named it. We checked everything. The picture changed. The data points would change when we only looked at units greater, earlier than 2000 or later than 2000, or only done for hospitals versus prisons or whatever. So, who are you going to believe, the data or your lying eyes? So Paul Joskow, at the risk of people throwing stuff at me, summarized the literature here. Again, this isn't necessarily my position. My point is, I think we should be a little bit more skeptical with respect to claims on any energy efficiency technology, not just energy efficiency. The reliance on energy engineering estimates tend to be too high. Overestimation of savings in practice, non-transparency on the data source. There's a running joke even within the energy efficiency industry about there's one study done in 1989 that is cited in a technical resource manual in 1990 in one state, then cited in another manual in 1992 in another state. And when you do the archaeological expedition to get down to ground zero, it's one study or a handful of studies, 30 years old, that are the basis of 50 different states manuals or 30 different states manuals. What I am saying, though, and this is literally comes from Professor Joskow as well, is that we're not saying, or I'm not saying there's no case for public policy intervention. I can imagine a lot of good reasons to intervene on energy efficiency and other clean energy technologies. But we just need to put in place, this will be my point, the appropriate evaluation mechanisms to make sure if we are getting what we're getting, great, perhaps we're getting even more. And if we're not, then we can take the appropriate policy response. So now we're back here. I kind of moved energy efficiency over here. And my point here is, though, with energy efficiency, what it really should be competing with is not with the old, dirty approaches, but with energy renewables as well, right? So this is the bench, the bar now. Okay, so we have to talk about renewables. This is from the U.S. government EIA. It's still in existence, but perhaps tomorrow it won't be, who knows. This is levelized cost of electricity. It's not the only number. It has lots of limitations, but it's for a good starting point thinking about the relative cost of different technologies. So this is the total system levelized cost of electricity for different technologies, taken with a grain of salt. They're generic. What I want to point out is offshore wind and onshore wind, at least according to these numbers, about 2.5 times. Now, I don't know the cost of offshore wind in New Jersey. It hasn't been built. I haven't seen a proposal, so maybe the numbers are very different. Who knows? But at least this is one data point. Lazard does another one. At least with EIA, you can see all the numbers behind the numbers. This isn't the case with Lazard. But my point here is just to show the range of LCOEs, levelized cost of electricity, without any subsidies for different solar. So grid-size solar is much less expensive than rooftop for the obvious reason. Again, these are generic numbers, and it could be different in New Jersey or other places. And here, the offshore wind versus onshore, again, this factor roughly of 2. Again, these are generic numbers, doesn't mean that's the case here in New Jersey. Okay, so from this context, what am I trying to get at? So my first point is that it requires building and maintaining long-term political support. There's some decent polling data, at least some polls, that New Jersey residents support this. They understand there is a trade-off between the environment and the economy, and we have to make decisions. But so they may be willing to go down that path, but my suspicion is part of their willingness will depend on how cost-effective all this can be done. Colleagues here and elsewhere had shown that we're not on track to meet the 2050 goals. We are 2020. It's nothing like a recession and low natural gas prices to, as they would say in the Army, not the I think I won't elaborate on this, but it only takes one administration. It only takes a village, right, to really retard progress. And the question is, we have 8 more elections between now and 2050, right? So we need a policy that's in place that's immune as best as possible to future legislatures and governors. The recent reductions in some parts, not the only explanation, has been what I mentioned, coal and the recession. Here's the evidence or the graph from the recent report out of Rutgers and Georgetown, Jean Herb and her colleagues, in terms of where we are. We're about 100 million tons, metric tons. We want to get to 80%. As an aside, what matters for greenhouse gases is the cumulative emissions, not the annual emissions, but it's easier just to talk about stuff this way. That reduction is about 26 coal plants, or 25. It's actually more like 23. Just at the risk of people throwing things at me, there are 1,600 coal plants that are being built or being planned in this year worldwide. So in terms of adaptation, not mitigation, we're dependent on the rest of the world. I think we should be upfront about that. I read a lot of papers or op-eds where people walk very close to the line that's saying if New Jersey reduces its greenhouse gases, we won't have any more Superstorm Sandys. That's just not the case. So we just need to prepare the public that we can make substantial inroads on mitigation, and we still have to make investments on adaptation. Otherwise, there may be some political blowback. So here, what I'm not saying, though, it's always risky making statements like this because people say, well, it'll be misconstrued that nothing should be done on mitigation. Well, the governor gets to choose that, or the electorate, and they chose that, for better or for worse. Now let's pursue that policy in the most cost-effective way, and let's try to garner all the other benefits we can with respect to clean energy, for example, air emissions. Okay. Secondly, the programs need to be cost-effective. Just keep in mind, the wholesale price of electricity in New Jersey is about 6 to 7 cents, depends on the day, the hour, and so forth. Remember, the total cost for electricity is about 15 cents on average. These are rough numbers, Paul, so don't write them down too carefully. Retail prices, around this 14 to 15 if you average them in. And when you look at the studies, benchmarking studies, the cost of different energy efficiency programs within New Jersey vary by a factor of 88 times. Now, there may be some very good reasons for that. Typically, low-income programs are more costly, and for good reason, and it doesn't mean they shouldn't be done, but there's a wide variation both in terms on the energy efficiency side and in terms of these RECs and SRECs or XRECs. So there are other important policy objectives. We'll get to that. In New Jersey, many of the programs, not all, require some type of CBA, but none require cost effectiveness. So there's no requirement in the Offshore Wind Act, for example, that it be cost effective. Whatever the policy objectives, there's no requirement to demonstrate that that's the least cost way to achieve those objectives. At some point, New Jersey should just come out and put a price on what it's willing to pay to reduce greenhouse gases, either for planning purposes or in effect through a market-based approach, which would really be my preference. But it's better, I think, to be explicit. This is what we're willing to pay to reduce a ton of CO2 or ton of greenhouse gas, CO2 equivalent, and then go from there. And then that will help push the policies to a more cost-effective way. So a little bit of math. We're in the Bloustein school, so I can only do simple arithmetic and multiplication. I would screw it up otherwise. So you can see where this is going. If you had a 1,000 megawatt resource and it operated 90% of the time, that would be the energy equivalent, just in megawatt hours. There are other implications. With a 2,000 megawatt at 45% or a 6,000 megawatt at 15%, right? That's just arithmetic. Here we go. So the 3 reactors in southern New Jersey, they're about 3,500 megawatts, depends, some are winning rating. Their capacity factor, depends on the year and the unit, is about 90%. If you assume offshore wind, it's a reasonable assumption, maybe it's 50% with bigger turbines, maybe it's higher, maybe it's lower, but this is not a crazy number. Then you would need the equivalent of 7,000 megawatts of offshore wind to replace these units. Now, my point here is not to advocate for offshore wind or nuclear or any of that. It's just to give you a sense of the comparison, what one would have to do if these units, when they retire, if and when they retire. If you replace the nuclear units with this amount of offshore wind, which is a heavy lift, you have not changed CO2 emissions to a first order. You're back at the starting point. So it's something one may want to think about if your goal is to reduce CO2 emissions. Now let's try to do a little bit of cost. The cost of electricity or natural gas is not the only thing in town, right? Your bill is price times quantity, but it's a good metric for this type of discussion to figure out what's going on. And here is, I'm just saying that just to give this equivalence, 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and you're looking at your bill, 15 cents roughly, is 10 cents is $100 a megawatt hour, just so you can do the unit conversion. Okay, so let's look at this table. On this y-axis over here, this first column is a percentage of XREC. So you get to pick your favorite XREC or combination. You can even throw energy efficiency in there, okay, and adjust for the quantity reduction. This top row is the XREC cost in dollars per megawatt hour. All the numbers in here are in cents per kilowatt hour because I want to compare it to 15 cents, which is all the red numbers or anything that's greater than 15 cents. So if we buy 100% of our XRECs and they cost $500 an XREC, that's 50 cents per kilowatt hour. Everyone see the math? This is why it's so important to get to be cost effective. Now, this does not include the energy, the capacity, the ancillary services, the transmission, distribution, resiliency enhancement, societal benefits charge, or sales tax. So this is why we need to make sure we're in the black as opposed to the red. All right. So here is my bottom takeaway, and so I'll spend a little bit of time on this, which is it's not just a matter of the individual policies, but it's getting the strategy right and the institutional framework. What's great about New Jersey is they'll try anything, right? So with the DECA, we'll leave it at that. Back in 1999, New Jersey and many other states moved away from a regulated generation or wholesale industry, electric industry, to a market-based one, both on the retail and then on the wholesale side. And so prior to that, utilities, the electric utility, we have to show up at the Board of Public Utilities and do something, yes, you can shudder, integrated resource planning, which had lots of problems. I'm not advocating it, but let's keep it in mind. They had to go to the regulators and say, here's my least cost plan. It used to be, or also is called least cost planning or management. Here's my plan. Stakeholders got to kick the tires. The board got to review it, and there was some negotiations, right? There was some politics involved. But then that was the plan, and it was implemented, then it was revised over time. But we are now moving to a situation, or we're in a situation where instead of having the utilities doing integrated resource planning with oversight, commentary or comments or probing by the stakeholders and oversight by the board, the legislature is doing integrated resource planning. Now, whatever you think of integrated resource planning, I suspect having the legislature do it may not be the best solution, right? So,
I'll second
that. I'm not criticizing the New Jersey legislature. I would never do that. But it's just not in their wheelhouse, right? It's just not what legislatures are supposed to do. And even within this list of things, some there's more or less a rigorous process, offshore wind. With nuclear payments, who knows what's going on? I'm sure some people know what's going on, but there's no process protection, regulatory protection with many of these. So for example, smart thermostats, someone said, a legislature said, we should require smart thermostats because he or she read somewhere they reduce energy savings by they reduce energy consumption by 20%. Now, I know I've read, I wouldn't say every paper on smart meters ever written, but I've read a lot, okay? And I didn't see that number anywhere. It doesn't mean that it's not correct. It's just not what legislatures should be doing. So we're in this position where we've combined the least desirable elements of integrated resource planning with inefficient electricity markets. We no longer have this planning authority, but we're not fully committed to markets. Some of these policies will undercut efficient electricity markets, and I'll talk about why that damages not just the markets themselves, but the markets for clean energy resources. And most importantly, the risk of bad investments is being transferred slowly and surely back to ratepayers, but without the procedural protections. That is huge, okay? I mean, God bless the industry for doing this, but this I think is just not acceptable. We're in the worst of both worlds. And as I mentioned, even if a CBA is required, and it's not always is, cost effectiveness is not. So this is from a bill or legislation that describes cost-benefit analysis. I won't bore you on the details, but if someone could write down the formula that's in this paragraph, I would be grateful. I have tried for days. Dave Coyte's here. Dave, I'll buy you lunch if you can. You won't. Perhaps, words just aren't getting there with respect to this. Okay. So along these lines, the policies are a mixture of everything. We'll try anything: mandates, subsidies, market-based. It's implemented by the utilities, by the Office of Clean Energy. It's implemented by third-party contractors, right? Even within a sphere such as energy efficiency, we have this wide range of implementation. The Energy Master Plan, so you say, oh, well, we have this process, the Energy Master Plan. It will corral all this, and yes, that's the intent. But it has no teeth. It doesn't have a financing mechanism. It doesn't have a requirement that the policies be coherent. It doesn't have a requirement that the policies be least cost. Even if you pull together a brilliant EMP, you still have to go to the legislature, or will likely have to go to the legislature for various financing. So I've just said these things. There's not an offshore wind funding mechanism. I think the current administration may dispute that, but I suspect the developers are a little bit shy of using the current mechanism. And we're losing this funding mechanism, although the new governor and even the other candidate said they would return to RGGI. So it's not enough to have a plan. You have to have a financing mechanism to implement that plan. Moreover, over the summer, the board decided to revisit its rules regarding infrastructure. I don't want to weigh into that debate whether that was a good idea or bad idea, but this is just one other means besides a rate case for the board or for public policy to make various investments. So it just adds to the long list of competing ways. It's almost as if every program has its own specific policy process for being implemented. Okay. The other piece is just structural, right? The BPU is not an executive agency. It's a board. It adjudicates. That's what its 100 years of law and customs and culture and regulations are about. Many of the programs or policies that the state are pursuing are market-based. So it's really outside. It's not cost of service rate making. It's a different type of skill set. The New Jersey state contracting process is a mess. It's worse than broken. If it was, if it were broken, we would say, hey, this is broken, let's fix it and come up with a solution that would be better than the current solution. But it just stumbles along just enough that people say, oh yeah, we have a contracting process, okay? Modifying a contract is basically writing a new contract, right? Everyone pretends otherwise. Trust me, I've lived through this. That means programs can't respond to changes in the marketplace. It means it's just very difficult to administer the program. I won't belabor the history, but this is a major, major issue. If you want the entity, the board of the Office of Clean Energy to run these programs. The Clean Energy Program evaluates itself. You'll see what the implications of that. I was telling someone that for a couple years in Italy, I believe it was in Italy a while ago, the medical professors were on strike, but the students still graduated, right? So the professors were on strike. The students weren't going to class or being tested. Just think what question you would ask your doctor, right? When did you go to medical school, right? That would be so, and my favorite line over here is, I don't think if I listed here, we don't do evaluation, we do programs. No, you have to do evaluations if those programs are to be efficient. And you'll see in a moment, there's a backlog of energy efficiency studies. Okay, so let's look at some results. The ACEEE, which is, I won't say an advocacy group, but kind of a very pro-energy efficiency group. They do a survey of states every year. This is the data, most recent study for 2016. So on the x-axis are the percent annual savings for the 50 states and territories and the number of states. So guess where New Jersey is? In terms of electricity, we're in this first bucket, this first, almost at the 0.5% per year. For natural gas, we're slightly better. We're a little bit above the 0.25 limit. The states that are in the top 3 for electricity are Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont. I don't think it's a coincidence, but I don't know. In terms of these, 2 of the 3 states are very small. In terms of natural gas, Minnesota is a very cold state. So now, of course, we can imagine that New Jersey could do better. Of course, it should do better, and we should try to make it do better. But at some point, we have to be realistic. So how does this work? Well, if you want 2% savings for energy efficiency, you could have 100% of the people save 2%. You could have 50% of the people save 4%. You could have 5% of the people save 40%. That's just arithmetic. And this 5%, in a moment, you'll see why this is optimistic. How does the funding work? Well, in the 5% model, we take money from 100 people and we give it to 5 people. So every 20 years, on average, you would get your money back, okay, plus administrative costs. Well, here's the financing model in theory. Here's it in practice. The money goes to other programs. The current administration made an art form of this, although they weren't the first to do this.
Yes, but the others were like 60 million.
That's fair. I said they raised it to...
60 million.
Absolutely. But that serves my point, which is the underlying cause has to be fixed. New Jersey's in financial straits. Now, maybe the next governor, the new governor, will be disciplined about this. I'm willing to believe that. But will the governor after that and after that? Because we're going to still have this underlying issue, okay? So even if, so anyway, I'll leave it at that. So let's talk about the 5%. Well, this is data from the Clean Energy Program, from the program administrator, the people who participated, the number of people or residents or households, or in a moment we'll see industries. So the second highest number is 14,000, that's 0.4%. The light bulbs is 5%, 2 million. Handing out subsidies or incentives for light bulbs, that's going to go away because the technology, pretty soon the market will catch up. So we're going to go off this lighting cliff. Much of the savings are in lighting, so that's a high number. In terms of commercial programs, this is 1.5%. So you get where this is going, right? If you want to rely, somehow we have to get beyond the delivery rate for these products. Let's talk about the backload of evaluation studies. This is an annual report CEEEP does on program evaluation, which is routinely ignored. This is a table that says which evaluations over the last 10 years that have been done. I'm going to emphasize the ones in red. Probably one of the most important is a baseline study. What energy products are out there? You need to know that baseline to plan against that baseline, right? Because if you don't know what dishwashers people have or what lighting facilities they have, you can't cost effectively design a program unless you're very lucky. There's just no way to do that. So you're thinking, okay, we'll just ramp up these studies, right? We'll give it the old college try. We'll invigorate the program. We'll get to that in a moment. So how do you calculate savings on energy efficiency? Well, there's the net savings, so those are the savings due to the program. It's the gross savings, the total savings with some adjustments. You have to adjust for the realization rate. So if you distribute 100 light bulbs and 5 of them break, the realization rate is 95%. I'm just making up the numbers. You have to subtract out free ridership. People would have participated in the program regardless, or bought the measure regardless of the program. So you have to do a study to determine that. And then you add back in spillover and market effects. In New Jersey, basically we assume net savings equals gross savings. Even ACEEE says this adjustment should be a reduction, not including the realization rate, of about 13% based on data from other states. Okay. Now you think, well, we'll just mandate the utilities to have energy efficiency, right? And then we'll incentivize them. Basically we'll ding or reward their return on equity, or however you want to provide the incentive. Okay, that sounds like a good idea. I'm not against that. But then we have to, that makes evaluation even more important. We have to have the baseline. We have to do the impact evaluations because we don't want to pay the utilities if they got lucky, and we don't want to ding them if they implemented a successful program, but the evaluation was wrong, right? We need to get this right. And unless it's right, politically, this will be very difficult to do. So let's walk through a Gantt chart. So let's say on January 16th, just to pick a random date, the new governor wakes up and says, my top priority is to get a baseline study and an evaluation study for New Jersey. Well, it'll take about a quarter to write the RFP and to issue, and I think this is an optimistic time period. You got to give the respondents 3 months. These are $1 million studies or potentially add up to millions of studies, so it takes some time for the consultants to provide proposals. It takes about a year to do a decent baseline study. You got to build in some safety time, in case something goes wrong. Then towards the end of that process, there's some overlap. You can start designing the programs based on the new baseline study. Now you want to implement the programs for 2 years. Towards the end of the first year, you can start designing the evaluation RFP. That takes about a quarter. And then at the end of the first year, you can issue that RFP and go through the contracting process and start the evaluation at the end of the year. Why do you want to wait a full year? Well, you want to go through the full seasons, the 4 seasons. And then you can argue about incentives. This is 6 months. I suspect if you look elsewhere, it took a lot longer than 6 months to come up with these final incentives. Again, I'm not saying this isn't done, but it makes a lot of assumptions with respect to the evaluations that need to be in place. Let's talk about offshore wind. No, we leave no clean energy technology behind. There are 2 developers for offshore wind in New Jersey. Now, we really shouldn't call it New Jersey offshore wind. It's wind development that will occur in federal waters that New Jersey ratepayers will pay for. Now, that's a long sentence, so we call it New Jersey offshore wind, right? But let's not forget, it's not happening in New Jersey, and the developers, at least these 2, aren't headquarters in New Jersey. The manufacturing is not in New Jersey. Maybe it will come here, and if done rightly, perhaps, I'm willing to believe. The Offshore Wind Economic Development Act does not require cost effectiveness, so it doesn't require head-to-head competition. Each developer can submit the proposal independently, so it's not even a duopoly, it's even worse. And in a moment, I'll show you how you can play with, not saying anyone would, but how you can play with the cost-benefit analysis to increase the revenues that the offshore wind developer would get. And so there's a current proposal, both in the existing law and some proposals can make this even more likely. So here's the analysis. An offshore wind project is the economic benefits and environmental benefits, very important, all on present value, account for the time value of money. And it's compared to, the revenue of the project. So for the developer, the ORECs are revenue. For you and I, it's a cost, right? The ORECs are a cost. So they're synonymous. It just depends who's paying the money, who's getting the money. Okay. There's a long list of things that should be included in the analysis. One is price suppression. I won't go into the details here, but if you hear the term price suppression, merit order effect, demand response induced price effect, or supply induced price effect, watch your wallet, someone has just stolen it, okay? This is just a con that would make the current president blush. So, the OREC costs, or the revenues that go to the developer, have to be less than the benefits on a present value. That's what the law stipulates. Well, if you increase the benefits, what does that provide? It provides the opportunity to increase the costs, okay? Who only really knows the cost of the development? The developer, right? You can try to get at those costs. I'm not saying you wouldn't be partially successful, but this is a difficult problem. So by trying to encourage more offshore wind or anything, by jacking up the benefits, and in the case of price suppression, it's not a benefit, it's a transfer payment, you open up this door. So some colleagues of mine outside of Bloustein, outside of CEEEP, on the marine and coastal sciences, this was their analysis, or their data collection was funded by the board, combined with Dave Coit and some students, now 2 professors. We integrated an offshore wind model, hour-by-hour wind speeds, into a production model for different sized wind farms. And then we added with some colleagues on air quality to translate that into changes in particulate 2.5. And the video I'm about to show you is just to show proof of concept, right? I wouldn't take any policy conclusions from it. It's just to show that we can integrate these models from the wind to the power sector, a PJM model, all the way to hourly air quality. So this video is pretty cool. Notice that you see spatches of blue and brown. I'll explain those in a minute. Okay, so just you see some brown, some blue, mainly blue. This is for a 2-week period in May, the hourly concentration of particulates using an EPA model, the Community Air Quality Model, CMAQ, for 2013, assuming a 3,000 megawatt offshore wind off the coast of New Jersey. We did a whole bunch of scenarios. Whenever you see a blue, that means the offshore wind compared to the no offshore wind case was cleaner. And whenever you see a brown, that shows that it was dirtier. Now, because PJM is interconnected, what happens in New Jersey doesn't stay in New Jersey. It's not like Las Vegas. With respect to electricity, you have this interaction effect. So let me just play the video again. Okay, that was wrong. Just so as I'm talking. So you see the interactions, the changes in air quality, not just in New Jersey, but throughout the region, okay, for particulates. Okay, and this shows just the complexity and the nonlinearity, but the importance of trying to get the modeling right, because you can get these counterintuitive in effect. Basically what is happening is in some hours the offshore wind is relieving congestion, allowing more dirty coal to be imported into or produced in Ohio. And we found one real hot spot in Ohio, right? This coal plant just starts belching out emissions. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do offshore wind, we just need to be cognizant of this effect. And then with some colleagues here at Bloustein, we added in a former doctoral student and some people here. We attached that to an economic model of New Jersey, so we can link all the models. Okay, I'll start wrapping up. Some recommendations. So structural recommendations. New Jersey should implement policies that are consistent with wholesale markets. I'll go in each of these in more detail. They should be subject to a truly independent economic analysis or competitive markets. If you're going to have a clean energy program, you need an independent evaluator of all the programs for the reasons I've been describing, and we need to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions. So why is it so important to have markets consistent, or policies in New Jersey are consistent with PJM? Not because PJM knows all the right answers, I'm sure they think they do. Not because I think electricity markets are just good in and of itself. It's because you need an efficient wholesale market to have efficient renewable and clean energy policies, including energy efficiency. In a moment, I'll give you the example, but if you don't know what the price is at the wholesale level, there's no way for you to properly figure out what the price should be at the XREC level, okay? They are interdependent. And so these are hand in glove. If New Jersey doesn't want to go down this route, then go back to IRP, re-regulate all the generation, and do that, and put my grandchildren through college. And so we'll see this in a moment. So here's the analysis. If you know the price of electricity, it's hard enough to project that 20 or 30 years. Imagine an offshore wind developer. Their XREC is the difference between their levelized cost of electricity and what they think they can get from the market. If they think this wholesale market will be undercut or be corroded away, then what do they have to do? Well, for their financing purposes, they're not going to be clear, sure, or less sure about what the price will be, which will mean that will raise the risk of the XREC, and they're going to have to build that into their financing model, which will increase the cost. Why do we need PJM? Well, we're going to have the grid around for a long time, regardless of what you think about storage. We're going to have it for the next X number of years, decades, not years, at a minimum. I think even longer, but I could be wrong. We need to balance supply and demand almost instantaneously across the grid. We want to use the grid to garner the economies of scale and the reliability across multiple states. I know it's hard to believe, but New Jersey is part of the union. We're part of the Eastern Interconnect. We need to integrate on the second fraction of a second basis all the way out to hours, days, and years, if we have any chance of trying to get to a cost-efficient solution. I would ask, I won't do this, but you can do the thought experiment. What would have happened if the industry was regulated, the electric utilities still own a generation that was subject to regulation as opposed to market? How many coal plants would be running that aren't running right now? But different people may have different views. Secondly, proposals should be subjected to an independent evaluation. Now, this requires proposals actually to state what their objective is. Unfortunately, I think a lot of proposals in general, but particularly with clean energy and even on the nuclear and fossil fuel side, is a solution looking for a problem. And what a surprise, the solution solves all problems. And if you ever have a solution that solves all problems, it's likely, or could be likely, the case that it doesn't solve any of them, okay? So we may need different solutions for different problems. So we need to spell out the problem we're trying to solve as opposed to the solution we're trying to advocate. We need to compare across these technologies for cost effectiveness. And if we're going to rely on markets, markets are not inherently efficient. People's wrongly claim, well, it's a market, it must be efficient. I've heard that line over and over. That's not the case at all. There can be inefficient markets, efficient markets, and everything in between. And so we need to make sure the markets themselves are efficient. This is just a little cartoon or schematic showing the various types of modeling that my colleagues and I have done throughout Rutgers on different time scales and different spatial scales. Here's just in the interest of time, variety of people I've worked with, not just in the Bloustein School, but throughout the campus on all sorts of things, smart grids, power system. You've seen this reliability, resiliency, reducing emissions from fertilizer. This can make a difference worldwide if you get the Fischer-Tropsch, whatever process rate. I don't know what that means, but it sounds like a good idea. And then a lot of stuff here at Bloustein and throughout the university on integrated climate change with regional models. We need to have an independent evaluator. I think the model here is something along the lines of what the ISOs and RTOs have. It needs to be an independent entity. It needs to have a long-term contract. If you have an annual contract, then you're held hostage. Your future year funding is held hostage based on what you're doing this year. You need access to the public. You can't have the program administrator or whoever's being evaluated restrict your ability to publicly report, because they will. And you need the evaluator needs the same information at the same time that the program administrator has, because if there's a gap in that, if you're dependent on the program administrator to get the data to evaluate them, problems can arise. We need to put a price on emissions. It's widespread agreement, at least in the economic literature. I know it's disputed. Returning to RGGI is a good step. It's not the only step. It's a good start. RGGI is tightening up its caps, and it's trying to pull in Virginia. And when New Jersey returns to RGGI, that reduces leakage. When Virginia implements a RGGI-like policy, that reduces leakage, right? And if we're going to go down this road of mitigation, where we're going to try to reduce our greenhouse gases, it's important that we implement a policy that can extend it. And RGGI was designed to do this throughout the United States and worldwide. Otherwise, it's not, we're not leveraging our efforts as much as we could have. We'll need to extend this to other states and other fuels, so oil, natural gas, it's coming, and to work with other states and PJM to do so. Now, RGGI provides, if we recycle the revenue back to ratepayers or the people who pay into, I think that will help with the political support. I think we're quickly going to find out, and if we already haven't, that unwinding subsidies is very, very difficult. So if you put a program in place that made sense for that time, that context, that gestalt, 5 years later, if you have to change it, unwinding that subsidy is just very, very difficult. So I won't beat that drum too hard, but we need to consider this. Otherwise, this approach of we're going to subsidize everything isn't scalable, all right? So William Nordhaus of Yale says, you just can't subsidize everything. To misquote Margaret Thatcher, probably at a risk, if you subsidize everything, you quickly run out of other people's money, right? It's just not going to work at the scale that we need if we're going to meaningfully reduce greenhouse gases. So here's the current approach, which apparently is politically feasible because it's implemented. We take money from 95 people, give it to 5 people, and then we siphon off some of it. Okay, that's the current approach. Somehow that's more politically feasible than this approach, which is we generate the revenue from the sale of emission allowances or from taxes, greenhouse gas taxes. We recycle this back like British Columbia does, and that changes the incentive, because if I can reduce my carbon footprint, then I save more money. So it provides the incentive on the demand side and on the supply side. Now, you've got to get the cap or the tax correctly. But arguments that this is more politically feasible than this, I find hard to believe. I mean, I'm not a political scientist. Maybe I have something wrong. But quickly, other recommendations, evaluations. They need to be designed in at the start of a program. We design a program, then we wait 2 years, and then someone says, hey, we should evaluate that program. And so we all put on our safari hats and go back 5 years in time and to dig up, using data that's electronically not compatible with my current computer to figure out what happened for a program that has changed 3 evolutions since we're evaluating. So if you design this in And CEEEP and others worked with the BPU a couple years ago in order to do this. From program administration, needs to be, we need to collect the data. I won't beat this drum in terms of time, but the data needs to be continually collected. Industry always pushes back. Why do I need to provide this data? It's costly. Well, we're giving you money. That's why you need to provide the data, so we can then evaluate this down the road. Studies, when feasible, should use controlled or quasi-controlled experiments where possible. And we need to address a lot of shortcomings institutionally with respect to leadership, direction, management, internal capabilities, and training. Finally, green jobs and transparency. So there's a lot about green jobs, and yes, clean energy technologies can be done in a way that promote employment and economic activity, even in addition to the externalities. But let's solve the problem of figuring out who is underemployed, whose wages are too low, who is unemployed, figure out who those people are, where they live, and if it's the right fit to have a clean energy program, do that. But if a different fit program or workforce development, so let's start not with the solution and find the problem. Let's start with the problem for people who actually know what's going on in terms of workforce development, and then figure out the policies that we need to. And if they're clean energy, that's great. And if they're not, if more cost-effective policies are available, let's use them. And if we're going to go down this route, let's track how many jobs we actually create. Let's do it in a rigorous way. Let's find out in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, are we really promoting getting the intended benefits? Maybe we're getting more jobs than we realize. That would be good news. If we're getting worse, then we need to make the adjustments. Just as a caveat, many energy projects, as I mentioned, are capital intensive, which means if your goal is jobs, not just economic growth, but jobs, 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 you have to address this. Installing a more efficient light bulb that lasts 6 years as opposed to 6 months isn't a job-producing mechanism. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it's not a job-producing mechanism, particularly if the light bulb is manufactured out of state. And I think we need to provide more transparency. I know this is a touchy issue, but we need the public to see what's on their bill to provide some additional public feedback in terms of this. So one slide, and then I'm done. I want to come back to this slide. Over 8,300. Maybe this number is wrong. Maybe it's only 4,000. Maybe it's 12,000. The point of me hammering away on cost effectiveness and policy design and institutional decision making isn't for money. It's for lives, right? People's jobs, people's health, the economy of New Jersey. And so I think if we keep this in mind, this is a way that will help force us the importance of being cost effective so that we can achieve the goals that we're trying to do in a way that touches more people's lives in a positive way. With that, I'll open up for questions and comments. Just say who you are quickly.
I'm Item Arizona with Connex. What are your thoughts on pricing carbon in wholesale markets? It's not economy-wide like a carbon tax would be.
Well, ideally, you want it worldwide. So then the question is, if you do it on a regional basis, can you scale that up and wait for, we're like revisiting Reggie, right? Dale's revisiting past history, scale it up to the next administration. But yeah, so I think we should put that, start with electricity and build out in terms of New Jersey, and then show that that's workable, feasible, and then when we get a new administration that's willing to do this on a national way, that would be my approach. Yeah. Mike.
So, in the wholesale market, is it, and then I'll hopefully ask some additional questions. But in the wholesale market, is it better to have a PJM market or a NISO market or an ERCAT? So a state-only
Right.
Texas model or the PJM market?
Okay, well, in the context of New Jersey, it's not leaving PJM. I mean, if you want to raise costs, increase emissions, and reduce reliability, create its own electricity control area.
Right, but if you're getting more distributed, is it the utilities that manage that distributed, smaller local electricity, or is it PJM?
Yeah.
Which is sort of, that's where my
Yeah.
question is going.
Yeah.
Is it some sort of hybrid to be?
I think it's a very exciting question, and I didn't touch like the utility of the future and the DSO and the RTO. I kind of just punted on all that for time. So those are emerging questions. I really don't know. I'll let others.
Oh, on that issue, Michael and I have been talking for 15 years about the communications with the grid system, distribution system, the two-way communications, which is necessary.
Right.
If you do the two-way communication, you would think that the utility in your franchise area would operate literally as the RTO or the ISO do. But they be controlling that information.
Right. So we're now.
Like ITO does now.
Right, so this is the issue. Should the DSO be the utility company, or do you need that independence? So we're now back to the whole ISO RTO debate, which was for those not to have a life. That's independent system operators and regional transmission organizations, and those systems, the operator is a utility under federal law, but it's not a player in the market. They're in effect nonprofit. They're not, PSEG is not the RTO. And so if you go down this DSO route where you're now kind of propagating this down to distribution system operator, the question is, can a utility both manage that market and set the price and make decisions when you have competitor players, solar, storage, energy efficiency, demand response? And New York is going down this route. So I guess my view would be, let's see what happens in New York and other states. Let's at least once leverage federalism for us. If it works, hey, thank you, and then adopt it. Just cite them, so then we're not plagiarizing, and off we go. So that would be my suggestion on that. And I do have more thoughts. We can talk offline, but yes.
Paul Hyten, New York has NYSERDA, California has CEC.
Yeah.
To your point of resource planning through legislators, why not put, a competent energy office like that can help, like CEC and NYSERDA in New Jersey? I know that's highly political, but you can fund completely.
Yeah, no, I think that's the right question. I mean, it sounds like a rhetorical question, so that's why I'm not answering. But if you're going down the planning mode, and there's nothing wrong with planning, I'm in a building of planning. If that's your strategic mode, then you're right. You need that whole apparatus and the procedural protections and the independence and so forth. If you're going to rely primarily on markets, you can't exclusively do that. But if you are, then you need a different type of evaluation, people who are experienced in evaluating markets, environmental markets and wholesale markets. But you still need the independence, you still need the protection, so when they report something that someone doesn't like, their contract isn't put on detention. Yes?
Good morning, David Again. I advise governments around the world on a bunch of these things, including NAMAs and frameworks. I'm a little bit angry because...
At me?
No.
Oh.
We could be here till midnight discussing some of your assumptions, but they're assumptions. What's the big deal? I'm angry because whenever I go around the globe and help the federal government, New Jersey's about last on the list of anything with regard to a priority of sharing and getting in. So I come to these events to try and make New Jersey much further up. And actually net income to New Jersey, people like me, and there aren't many of us flying around the world doing this stuff. I got a little bit confused. So within all of this, what do you want us to do different in New Jersey?
Pretty much everything. I think we have solutions looking for problems instead of problems looking for solutions. I think the institutional arrangements are all over the map. I don't think there's a coherent strategy. I think if the assumption is we just scale up of what we're already doing, I don't think that will work. I don't think it will work technically. I don't think it will work economically, and I don't think it will work politically, because over time it won't achieve the results. So I think the emphasis has to be on cost effectiveness and institutional design and governance. Get those things right, and then the policies will flow better in terms of what's being achieved. I guess my fear is 4 years from now, will we be in a materially different place than we are right now? So.
Well, we're going to be anyway. So is there a transition team that's being influenced right now?
I'm Jean Fox, and myself. I'm a co-chair of Murphy's Energy and Environment Transition Team. There are, I believe, to be 5 co-chairs of that team. The press release is going out today. I won't tell you who the others are, because it can always change. The transition team members are not out yet. That should be out later this week. And I don't know who they are, but it's a recommendation.
Other questions? Yes.
And it will be a lot different in 4 years, Frank is right.
It's going to have to be.
It has to be.
The market will. And excuse me, on the other question, if if you're not having this conversation without Utility 2.0 is extremely difficult, because through my relationships, I'm privileged to know directly the phone numbers of CEOs of at least 6 major utilities across the United States. And while there aren't much public, the utilities' role in distribution systems of managing information and moving away from actually creating electrons has already been made. They're all playing, and in 5 years from now, we're going to see massive changes in how electrons are distributed and what their role is. We should be there at the front line, and that's where my anger comes. I actually have the government that believes ahead of where we are in New Jersey.
Okay.
That's frustrating.
Yes.
My question is very specific.
Who are you, please?
Pranav Dotterway. I'm an owner of an energy service company,
Okay.
renewable energy service company, East Bronx. Specific question is, it is not your program or policy related, but one is, which is probably the energy savings, specifically energy storage, specifically on the battery energy storage. What kind of incentives are available?
Okay, yeah. The person you should talk to is maybe Mike Winko, who's in the back, and who works for the Board of Public Utility. Or, so you should talk to someone that's, yeah, or Scott Hunter or others. Offline, I can also give you some other names. Yes.
Christine Bader, former BPU commissioner. I really enjoyed you talking about looking at the cost, because, you know, limited dollars, you want to make sure you put it in the most effective area. But one thing that, when a long time ago, we could have so many different programs doing the same thing. And so I think your idea of combining all these under one roof, I personally think that the BPU could be the right place.
And we did for what?
And we did, and I think it's, I mean, you can't like farm this stuff out to DP or any other agency, or even the legislature, because they don't really, but in one agency, they have the expertise, they are the energy agency, and they could be today. I mean, that's where
And I think, yeah.
And the cost is so important, because we have limited dollars, so put it where it counts.
Okay. Yes. Yes, sir.
Steve Pope, Orange Mountain Energy. So along that line, you have energy efficiency devices that are part of the IoT, the Internet of Things. Those can talk to somebody. They should be talking to somebody, right? If you're talking about data points and making sure that it's tracked, allow that to happen. But there needs to be somewhere that data is flowing to. I think that's getting to your point of,
Right, but that's correct, but we need to take a step back and setting up all the incentives and the structure so that the incentives are aligned, and what are a model that you want to go down. So at least it's internally consistent is very important. So it's not just a matter of, hey, there's a lot of data and a lot of technology. Sure. But the question is the fundamental strategy and incentives and evaluations and markets, in my opinion. Other questions or comments? Dale.
Thank you so much, Raina. That was excellent. You know, governors and legislators don't poach the money that the utilities have to buy electricity from a power plant. They only poach the money that the utilities have or that are in the system in the electric bill, that when it sits in a pot with a big bullseye on it. So lots of states are facing this, right? You just saw what's happening in Connecticut. So what, you know, have you been thinking about different ways of structuring this whole thing? Because if we did everything completely new way, where the clean energy resources are looked upon as any other resources and not as a subsidy, but as purchasing a resource.
Right.
You know, that's how we're delivering our energy services to our customers, and it's structurally in a way that they can't be poached.
Right. I suspect you've done a lot more thinking than I have on this. I suspect, too, our views may be a little bit different. I'm not sure I buy the assumption that energy efficiency is a resource. I mean, I'm not sure what that means. A supply is different from demand. But I get the point that's well taken. So in my view, I would start first with low-income programs, make sure they're right. That's a good thing. I would accept the fact that there are many organizations, local governments, even state governments, that don't have access to capital markets, maybe smaller organizations where programs should be implemented. Now, whether the state does it or utilities do it, that's a different issue. I'm not adverse to the utilities taking a larger role. I think we should do one or the other, because in New Jersey, we have this mixture. I think we should be very skeptical of whoever's doing it, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit. Both have an incentive problem, they just have different incentives. What's nice about the utilities is they respond to financial incentives. That's at the end of the day, that's what they're going to do. Nothing wrong with that. The difficulty is, at the end of the day, energy efficiency, you're always measuring a but-for. What would have happened otherwise, right? And so playing around with the baseline. So there's an example where a baseball park, would turn their lights on at 2 p.m. in the afternoon to jack up the baseline. The university, this was great. They would bid into PJM demand response during spring break, which I thought, darn, why didn't I do that? And gaming happens on the generation side as well. I mean, trust me. So, and my only other concern is it has to be consistent with all the other pieces in terms of, renewables and so forth, storage. But I'll leave it at that. Yes. The price on carbon gets you to mitigation, reduction of emissions. It may not necessarily improve air quality, because that could be local. And if the price on carbon is just electricity, then you have the transportation emissions. So my focus here on electricity, besides my background, is typically you get the electricity right, and then you reach out to electric vehicles, maybe even heating. So it doesn't address income inequality, if that's your goal. Although if you recycle the dollars, you can do it in a progressive way. British Columbia is doing that. There are many ways to do that. It doesn't get on other environmental pollutants that aren't subject to the tax. But if your primary goal is mitigation, I think that's a policy. Now, you can do other policies, targeted energy efficiency, or not just targeted, or transportation issues in order to get air quality, the equity issues. And in terms of workforce development, I don't think that will help. I think you should tailor that to the needs of the people who are underemployed or unemployed or need wage support. But yeah, it's a great step.
One other question on cost. One of the things that struck me when we were in Reggie, that there were so many different administrative levels of cost. So how do you get rid of some of those administrative costs at Reggie?
One, expand the pie. The more states that are in it, you only need one CEO and there's always a communication director. I never know what that person does, but you're only amortizing that salary across. And I don't know the amounts of those costs.
Because the money could be put into a
Right, but on the other hand, yeah, Reggie's only like 4 people or so.
After she had to leave, obviously, she was basically left out. She went to Reggie for 5 years. There was only a couple of staff.
Yeah.
She's now there's only a couple.
But also, RDEP had administrative budget as well as.
Right, but how much were the money?
It's capped by the statute. Okay.
Yeah. And the other thing is, you don't want to have them implement the auctions incorrectly, right? I mean, paying an extra $500,000 so that the market is efficient, or reducing the probability of gaming and so forth, or whatever, I'm not made up that number, is very important. Same deal with energy efficiency, right? I mean, this notion that we're going to save $1 million here or $500,000 here while we're spending $30 million over here just strikes me as we're back to the medical school analogy I gave. Yes, in the back. Yes, sir.
Just wanted to thank you for the kind of full range proposal. Although there was this kind of sobering moment that we have 8 gubernatorial elections between now and 2050 ahead of us. And obviously all of us, understand how things went to address the wrong climate policy under the Christie administration. We can only hope the Murphy administration is a similar 180 of a positive change, a positive delta of climate change. I guess I was curious, however, when we look at clean energy policy, we actually see a lot of progress in states like Massachusetts with Governor Baker and energy efficiency policy. Governor Hogan in Maryland is actually moving forward with offshore wind. So in many ways, clean energy, on at least the state level, can hopefully break out of kind of the partisan level that we see strained with Congress. And I'm curious, looking at the recommendations you're putting forward, it seems like there's a lot of good case studies in other states, and I was just wondering if you were referencing kind of other state models that have gotten this right, where New Jersey's obviously been falling behind.
No, I would talk to other people, Dale and others, who've probably done a lot more work on that. I'm not saying there aren't. I didn't do a systematic review. I'm somewhat familiar with what other states are doing. My caution would be look carefully. Some students and I, we go and we look at the studies behind some of these claims, and they're hard to put your finger on, or there's some gambling going on in Vegas, so to speak, in terms of the results. So I'm not saying there aren't better models, I'm sure there are, or that those models can't be helpful. I would just be cautious and really kick the tires, because if we find out 5 or 10 years from now, and more importantly, let's put in a robust evaluation system, so whatever model we go down, we find out the answer and adjust accordingly. And if the results are better than we think, hallelujah. I mean, I'm all for picking up $100 bills. So I'll stop with that.
There's a few $100 bills coming from the Volkswagen settlement on electric transportation. So do you see that as a big priority? I couldn't really discern the transportation part. I'm assuming it's all in the total energy base. I know the energy master plan finally adopted electric transportation as part of that. So do you see that as a big lever that we should be, we drive a lot, it's reasonable distances in New Jersey?
Right, but again, the same idea, whatever you're trying to achieve, reduction of air pollution or the transition to electric vehicles or CO2, I think the general institutional frameworks and apply. I'm not specifically commenting on particular, money from heaven transaction. That's a good example of you give people incentives, they will respond to the incentives, perhaps not in the way that you anticipated, which we're now back to. It's kind of important to have a robust and independent evaluation. Even there, the federal government took them a while to catch on to what was going on. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't.
Just watch electric transportation and utilities. Every business plan is focused on that.
Oh, yeah. No,
Well,
definitely.
right. Business plans put everything in rate base. I agree. Yes, Mary.
Mary Barber, Environmental Defense Fund. So thank you. And it sort of clearly presents a very not great situation. So I'm curious to hear from you and also from this audience. So how do it's broken. Okay, what's the step to start it fixing? We have a new governor, great, it'll be announced today. In my mind, I've been thinking for years, the BPU is the place where the leadership through the governor could happen. And it seems like there should be an open and transparent process that the BPU might start that would bring together all these stakeholders that are working. People will come to this state. People who are doing this successfully in other places will come to the table if we invite them. But I'm curious from you, because you've laid out very clearly it's broken and lots of recommendations. Can you tell us how you think this process to fix it should start?
No. I'm a little skeptical of stakeholders, and it's nothing against stakeholders. They behave as stakeholders behave, right? But I think the governor and the administration need to step back and say, okay, what are real priorities? And priorities can't be everything with respect to clean energy. They need to step back and think strategically what they're willing to do. And they know better than me to account for the politics. Obviously, there's going to be politics involved. They need, once they do that and figure out those parameters, and the other commitment I think they need to make is to rebuild the institutions, the personnel, the incentive structures, and so forth, because the bench has been depleted. I think those are the key areas. And then once they have that and the ability to credibly assess claims made by anyone, then that's the point to bring in stakeholders. And the EMP would be one mechanism of doing that. But if that turns into this massive political negotiation done by a 35-year-old out of the governor's office, that's great. But that person will just be trading off political,
Can I quote on that?
yes, please, 10 times smarter than me doing this. So what I'm worried about is that process, not surprisingly, will be politically driven. And there's nothing, well,
Always.
yeah, but this is a little bit throwing up your hand saying, I think New Jersey can do better than the current process. And I agree,
totally
right.
agree with you. I'm just saying, I think to suggest that you can ever divorce it from politics.
No, of course not.
Could I put a personal, look at that? Someone is one of
No,
five,
just kidding.
one of 5 co-chairs, right? But when I came as president of BPU back in January '02, and we had the deregulation, which also bill, the restructuring bill, which also included the societal benefit charge, we had hearings, all the state commissioners and I, as to what the people wanted. Then decided to set up an Office of Clean Energy, brought Mike Woodgo from DEP, put that together in early '03, I guess it was. And we had hearings specifically on what discussion, all over the state, people showed up all the time. So I think what, I mean, and that's what I'm into, that's what I do, right, open meetings and all that. But you also need the experts at the table with all the facts and the science and the legislative parameters, the statutory and regulatory parameters, and then you come back out with it. So I don't know how the administration is going to want to do it, because we haven't had a meeting yet. But it certainly will include, I think, you can call it, I hate the word, but robust stakeholder process, because the Clean Energy Council that was set up in '03 had 21 or 22 specifically identified experts, a utility guy or two, an energy efficiency guy, et cetera, enviro, that they're the ones who created that program, working with the staff, and I chaired that group. But the committee meetings were open to everybody. And then the board and the staff made recommendations, the Clean Energy Council made recommendations, and then the board took actions based on those recommendations, and almost always took the recommendations of the council. Now, I don't know what this administration is going to do, I don't know what did that, but clearly Energy Master Plan will have a lot to do with it. It's going to be a much better clean energy plan in my mind, what comes out of this.
Other questions? Well, hang on, you, Mike, and then Winka. Well, he's already spoken a couple times.
Anybody else?
No, I didn't. Over there, yes, sir.
I'm Ennis from. I'm a volunteer for Citizens Climate Lobby. It's a organization that's advocating for carbon tax at the congressional level. My question is, does it make sense to go back into RGGI also, as well as implement a program like British Columbia is implementing? Or would those two be mutually exclusive? Or if they are mutually exclusive, then would it make sense to go into RGGI and move that organization towards something like British Columbia is doing? Or not just participate at all and just go implement what British Columbia is doing?
No.
Or maybe coordinate with
Right.
what California and Washington are doing, so to counteract
Yeah.
what's going on at the federal level.
Very good. I think New Jersey will return to RGGI. That decision's been made. I think the revenues created from the sale of emission allowances, and it's then the RGGI, that cap has to come down, which RGGI is doing. Try to bring in other states, recycle that revenue broadly. Perhaps you have some particular programs, but which is the British Columbia model or variation. Now, British Columbia is taxing all carbon emissions, not just electricity. Get RGGI up and run, a meaningful RGGI or RGGI 2.0 or whatever, up and running, start recycling the revenue, see how that works, and then start building out from there. That would be my suggestion. Mike?
So I get it, cost effectiveness in the clean energy program. You're an economist, so that's gonna be higher on your list.
I'm an engineer, but, yeah.
So
it's even worse, right?
So in the statutes, there's like 5 different parameters. Cost effectiveness is one of them, maintaining a program for low-income program. Market transformation is another one. How do you balance out all of those requirements? And look at it, electric heat pump, twice as expensive as an electric hot water heater, but it's going to reduce 3 times as much as CO2 emissions.
So it depends what you're,
That's more expensive. Solar
Right.
was $13 a watt in 2003. place a bet on a winner into the future.
Well, see, that's why I would avoid that. So the current approach many times is you forecast, I think storage, I think DSO 2.0, I think CHP, I think.
Cost effective, you would have never done that. You would have never done it in an RPS. It would never have been cost effective. You would have
So are you saying New Jersey is the cause for solar panels now to be $1 a watt?
on a grid supply project, sure.
New Jersey has caused that drop?
Above 20.
No, I'm not disputing. I would look, so this learning curve or market effects argument, so the learning curve is exponential. So you have to double the production to get a 15 or 10% or 20% requirement. So, I mean, I haven't done the calculation, but my suspicion is New Jersey is a low piece. I would argue that if your goal is to transform the market, solar or the two technologies out in front, storage or whatever, that's fine. So that's your goal. You define specifically market transformation and you go down that route. Now, my view is that there's going to be trade-offs, but if you're never doing the analysis to begin with, then you can't even make this in a way. Instead, what happens is an answer is determined somehow in the political gestalt or geist or whatever the word is, and then they back into what we should do. So I think that is the issue, which is set out the goals, the specific goals, what you're trying to achieve, and then cost effectively reduce that. So if New Jersey wants to implement an R&D plan, okay, I'm not sure states would be the best position to do that, but fine, I'll let them do that. Then that's a set of issues. How do I get the most bang? You still want to be cost effective. You still want to maximize the dollar spent on the probability.
Butt heads, market transformation and cost effectiveness. I've done this for a long time. Just butt heads.
Yes,
You can't do
there are
both
trade-offs.
at the same time.
Right. Right, so you have to then go back to priorities. Is my priority to get near-term reductions? And I would ask the question what,
Just
okay.
cost effectiveness.
I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm saying you have to define a specific goal. So I can define cost effectiveness within the context of improving R&D expenditures. I can define cost effectiveness with low-income programs. I can define cost effectiveness within the reduction of greenhouse gases. Is it the only? No, it's not the only criteria. Absolutely. Yeah, maybe.
Programs will never be cost effective.
No, I'm not saying, no, you're not, that's not what I'm saying, Mike.
You want to look at a low income cost effectively. Whatever your goal is, you want to get it in the most cost effective way.
Yeah.
Multiple
That's
goals.
a different.
Jonathan, yeah. That's why I had that slide with all the different performance metrics. We'll talk off the line. I think we're similar than we are. Yes.
Jonathan Ragnar, Grid Alternatives. Just the observation that the focus on market transformation brings us back to the governance issue and the rateability of funding, not just in New Jersey, but other places like Connecticut. And I'm assuming there's haven't been any studies trying to really measure this, but based upon the generally held view that we're going to have to rely primarily on private capital over the long term for the kind of energy transformation that needs to be made. What kind of inhibition of private capital is being caused by the lack of consistency, on the governance side? And I would think it's a very hard thing to measure, though, because again, it's a but-for causation kind of issue. But the more folks that are willing to commit capital, the lower the cost of capital, and the more quickly you can leverage, and better you can leverage the government funds.
Right.
So
Which is an argument for the widespread taxing or pricing greenhouse gases, because it will then open up both on the demand and the supply side. Now, that doesn't solve the R&D externality, which I think Mike is also pointing out. In a meaningful way, the federal government has to solve that. New Jersey just doesn't have the budget.
That will be in the next 4 years.
Yeah, it won't happen, right. So then my suggestion is, if New Jersey decides to go down the R&D, the market transformation, which is fine, you have to think, okay, how much money do I have? What's the most cost effective? Is it trying to get two technologies out? Is it trying to just get LED, whatever, and go through a process where you try to be as rigorous as possible. There are a lot of probabilities. You'll get it wrong, so you have to evaluate it, and then you'll adjust accordingly. That would be.
And obviously, it's not a question of rateability of funds, but the same kind of impact. Something like the International Trade Commission solar panel case
Right.
is big time, just screws up.
Right, or tax incentives, right. Right, I mean, yeah. Let's do 2 more questions. Yes?
Well, getting at him, thank you for pushing so many thought-provoking moments into that time, because to make a change, you've got to get people to get off their backsides. There were more thought-provoking, what did he just say, so take this on the
Right.
road. But one of the ones that really got me going in the middle of that was the institutional framework stuff. And I wonder, in the institutional framework, when we talk about energy and keep it boxed in energy, and don't have a supporting state-level economic goal. My example, for instance, the one I've been working with believes that they have Horizon 2030, which is economic and quality of life. Energy's moved directly into how do we improve
Right.
quality of life. And I've whined about it, you've done a lot of thinking and action about it. How do you see that clean energy policy fitting in with the New Jersey Economic Goal Program so that we avoid policy changing from administration to administration, maybe have some legislative
Right.
foundations to build upon?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any specifics. My goal here was to raise those type of questions and to point out that if that efforts could be sustainable in a policy manner, is try to do it in a way that is cost-effective, that you are achieving the goals, it builds public support. Hey, we are making progress on this. It is worthwhile for New Jersey to have an R&D proposal. It is worthwhile to New Jersey to invest, and to spend, invest in low income, whatever it is. So I think we're now back to cost effectiveness in terms of that. But at this point, it's just raising, it's not just a tweaking this policy or this, it's trying to get to those underlying institutional questions. Any other questions?
Get a copy of your presentation.
Sure, why not? So it can be misquoted around the world. I hope I'm misquoted, I'll probably be better off. But.
One thing that's a certainty is with a high probability, let's say 10%, is if we
Not really a
don't do
certainty, but.
anything, in 100 years, it's a worldwide catastrophic calamity.
I think it's less than
So
100 years.
since we have that certainty, we've got to do the best, and New Jersey should be the leader to push the country in a direction to prevent that. And that's what our goal is. That's certain. We know that that's going to happen. Science has determined that, and there's no escaping that. So we have to keep that in mind.
Great. I will leave it at that. Well, thank you very much. Have a great day. Why don't you send me an email? Okay. Is that right? Do you have my email address? All right, here's my card.
I think I do, but let me get it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. You're welcome. Was that helpful?
Yeah, and I'd like to have your things selected.
Yeah, I'll send it. I'm trying to get it out.
Okay.
Nice meeting you. Yeah. Great to see you. How's everything? I have my Gilbert slides. Good to see you. See you with your Yeah. Send me an email if I don't get that. Very well done. Thank you. See you, Jackie. How are you? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, brother. Thanks for coming. Right, but it. Right, but if it's Right, I'm just saying it's got to be committed. And it's not going to happen overnight. Roughly. I mean, I would find it to increase the time. No, I'm
My opinion, as an advisor, the outcome was that we were going to take my decision. It's very tough to have you know the carry on is. So I'm advising the Ministerial of CARICOM. And CARICOM has now adapted its energy policy. So if you go to CARICOM, you can see what energy source and and what he's done is he's changing the role of the electric utilities because it's such a small community. They come the economies of and therefore their policy now is the role of the utility and the quality of its citizens. Not to deliver so aligning the objective utilities and community is changing how the next program. Unfortunately, we had Maria, and now because of I'm on my way to Miami right now, to discuss what the retail should be, and that is distributed energy, which includes solar, but I'm saying let's rebuild it by the grid. Right, but to let it roll. But what we have seen there, and there's the rolling impact because the systems global, is an increasing production don't need 600 megawatts, something like that. So for right now, if we rebuild Virgin Islands with micro solar, with Elon Musk is prepared to help, so maybe we'll do some batteries. We take away the contingency problem, figure out how to use it, and increase more and more penetration so that the current applying their incentives so that they can manage that, then you have a massive growth increase. Yes, so the implication there is you wouldn't care about that. Yeah, I mean, that's what you're saying. That's very important. But this is the idea of like, don't forget the other piece of utility you have to go there is that you start out being the minority, and therefore in the short term there is a great margin of value in that if you've got that storage, and I don't think you should go around with huge volumes of them more, but something happens, and you've got the storage and you
Hey, how are you? Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming. Hopefully I was somewhat clear.
No, it was understood.
So,
If you change the name of New Jersey to any state anywhere in the world, it will be the same.
I know. Okay, I'll talk to you soon. See you. Where is this in?
So that plan for a manufacturing facility, go to the US government and say, I'll go on and say, I don't want to So I believe in the next 3 weeks, when you look at the buildings that can be from, if we're in the right place,
no, that's fine.
St. Croix might be a stretch. St. Croix. Here, it's much easier to get money from lobbying. But if you can say that all those that are now going to land in Puerto Rico will pick up a factory, the infrastructure's already there. You just got a factory, you put your sole manufacturing in there, and people will fall over you. Get it? The only problem is that whoever comes back in the money, they really want to get rid of it. Your eyes opened up there. Oh, great. I'm going to go bust his chops. I came over with the and then I went to a meeting in New York. There's a people what's the end of something like that? No, get up. So it's 32.
So like nobody's there's like a world of other conversations that need to be happening that is not With the like, what is the complete new infrastructure so that everything's under one? Jane has really good document. She seems really, I don't know if you got a chance. She couldn't come up that time, so. Oh, I thought you still had the Phrygium. Yeah, I know. You know, my own. We also have a solution. Oh, okay. Everyone is.
How do you get to the resources to actually make it happen? So it's a great thing about it.
Okay.
Good to see you.
Did you figure out the path to change the road?
Your recommendations, yeah.
Yeah, we met. We're in my house. Yeah. We're moving forward, man. Okay.
What's the most effective way to do it? But they're all different. They're all different.
W2TH